people with attachment issues and addicts, in my experience, we're like walking umbilical cords, and we look to plug in where we can get needs met. And because of either boundary violations or just unmet childhood needs, and if you're raised by an immature parent or a parent who hasn't done their own exploration in their own lives, everything counts.
Right.
That's a thing that I say to myself all the time is everything counts.
Everything counts in early childhood. I love that. Welcome, beautiful souls, and thank you for joining us on the Primal Parenting Podcast, where we bring you the real science to empower your parental instincts and apply them in the modern world. I'm your host, Angela, the attachment activist. And today I want to play a little game. When you hear the 5 baselines of primal parenting, put them in the comments and you will be entered to win a free membership in the Smart Baby Sleep System, which is an attachment science-based approach to sleep for parents of babies and toddlers. So if you don't have a toddler or a baby, but you have a loved one who is expecting or who has a younger child, you could gift it to them. But we will be giving away a free membership today. And all you have to do is listen to the full podcast and comment when you hear one of the 5 baselines. And the 5 baselines of primal parenting I wish I would have had when I entered into parenthood. Too many of us figure out these things the hard and painful way. So the 5 baselines are attachment attunement. And of course, there's a lot more to be said about that, and you'll find bits and pieces in further podcasts. Hopefully, if you want to play the playlists and learn more, it's all centered around attachment. And emotional attunement is what builds attachment. But attachment is being built in the first year of life and then sort of cemented in the next 2. So the first 3 years, and of course, the first 5 years are exponential in terms of brain development. And the 5 primal parenting baselines are really just the secret sauce to getting all of that social emotional brain development right and setting up the attachment system to really give your child the best advantage in every single way throughout life. So attunement attachment. The second one is touch. We are human beings. We're social mammals, and affectionate touch builds the brain. And the third one is nutrition, which is breastfeeding at first. So if you just know the barriers in place and you can circumvent them and avoid them and be proactive in setting yourself up for breastfeeding success. This category with nutrition also involves avoiding the toxins that are unfortunately in our food supply now. So nutrition and breastfeeding, that's number 4 is play. The play state is an essential part of our brains as humans, and that play state is developing the brain. So watch for any of those 5. You can comment something that resonated with you about any of the 5, or just if you pick up on something to do with touch or attachment or whatever you pick up in this amazing interview with Andrew Levander, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But please put it in the comment and you'll be entered. We will comment the winner right here in the comments on YouTube. Also, welcome to anyone who's listening on Spotify or any of our other platforms. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing the hardest job in the world. And I sincerely hope that this podcast gives you a lot of insight and tools and confidence in your own instinct and helps you navigate the challenges of parenthood in the best and highest ways. So hit subscribe and share, and don't forget to comment to enter the contest for the free membership and online course of the Smart Baby Sleep System.
Unique focus for me as a therapist for 25 years.
That's great. So today I am so excited to be joined by Andrew Levander. He is the co-founder and runs Encino Detox Center and has 25 years of experience and expertise in addiction. So welcome, Andrew. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today on the Primal Parenting Podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Andrew, I know that you have deep expertise in addiction, and we want to talk about today the roots of addiction, and especially in early childhood, but throughout childhood, understand what it is underneath, because that's what's going to allow us as parents to lower the risk for our children. And then I imagine that's the understanding of the roots can also help with treatment, which is obviously your award-winning area of expertise. So, what can you tell us about the roots of addiction and what's underneath this? Or let's start with what is addiction? How do you define it? And that'll probably lead us into how it forms and what the foundational risks are.
Sure. It's kind of simple. Any behavior done repetitively that meets biological, psychological, social, and emotional needs has the propensity to turn into an unhealthy relationship. Whether that unhealthy relationship turns into what we call addiction or not, I think depends on the circumstances and the person. In my own life, I feel like it was the perfect storm. Your addiction, childhood development, attachment and addiction, or the different styles of attachment or the deficiencies in attachment. And I look at it as walking umbilical cords, and we look to plug in where we can get needs met. And because of either boundary violations or just unmet childhood needs, and if you're raised by an immature parent or a parent who hasn't done their own exploration in their own lives, everything counts. That's
Right.
a thing that I say to myself all the time is everything counts.
Everything counts in early childhood. I love that. Today, I am so excited to be joined by Andrew Levander. He is the co-founder and runs Encino Detox Center and has 25 years of experience and expertise in addiction. So welcome, Andrew. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today on the Primal Parenting Podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, Andrew, I know that you have deep expertise in addiction, and we want to talk about today the roots of addiction, and especially in early childhood, but throughout childhood, understand what it is underneath, because that's what's going to allow us as parents to lower the risk for our children. And then I imagine that's the understanding of the roots can also help with treatment, which is obviously your award-winning area of expertise. So, what can you tell us about the roots of addiction and what's underneath this? Or let's start with what is addiction? Like, how do you define it? And that'll probably lead us into how it forms and what the foundational risks are.
Sure. There are so many, I think, different definitions. You ask 100 people kind of thing, and you get, but I think there's some common understandings of addiction definition wise. It's kind of simple. Any behavior done repetitively that meets biological, psychological, social, and emotional needs has the propensity to turn into an unhealthy relationship. Whether that unhealthy relationship turns into what we call addiction or not, I think depends on the circumstances and the person. In my own life, I feel like it was the perfect storm for me in my early addiction. Your podcast and the melding of attachment and this topic of attachment, addiction, childhood development. I'm not overselling it to say it's always on my mind. Attachment deficiencies. What the day that we realize, oh my God, I'm anxiously attached. Well, then what? And once we learn more about ourselves and what do we do with all this information that we get? I am a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. I'm gonna dive right in there. And as a result of that, I think I was like all kids. We head down a path, and then our path gets derailed for whatever reason. In mine, it was because of early childhood trauma without the emotional capacity to manage or even know how to think or talk about what happened. And I developed migraine headaches because I didn't have the words, and I think my brain was protecting me from what was happening. I didn't develop, I think, natural attachments and trust in people because of my childhood experiences. But I did, looking back on my life, I did develop attachment and affinity towards things like pills. And I had a blanket that I held on to for way too long in my life. I
Mm,
really see these as objects, um,
yes.
and that were safer for me and
I
provided a.
hear that a lot, the attachment objects, even though they can have a place in comforting for young children, many times that is an early sign of it sounds like you're describing misplaced attachment. So that could be considered one of the roots of later addiction is misplaced attachment.
Well, yes, certainly in my case, I think that's a great point.
And thank you for
Just
sharing
to,
that. I
you're
like that you
welcome.
went through that and I appreciate your openness.
Oh, thank you. I can't tell you how many people here at the Encino Detox, of the 151 clients that we've had, 66% of the male clients have this as part of their story. So
Are male are men more affected by addiction or differently affected?
yes, well, the statistic is 1 in 6. Yet here we're seeing a lot more of it. So I think it didn't surprise me because it's not something that's talked about a lot in
Yes.
society.
So hard to really understand the magnitude of problems I'm finding in different areas that a lot of experts who are really on the inside like you are telling us that the statistics are way underreported. Do you agree with that?
Well, I do, but in this is kind of like a petri dish, a drug treatment center where the likelihood that disclosures are going to be made are far greater in this environment than anywhere else.
Right,
And
right.
so,
Like the CDC survey or
exactly,
NIH or
kind of we're dependent on self-disclosure. And
right.
so while we're in the process of disclosing and making disclosures, this tends to come up a lot, which is great, which is why I opened this place and spent thinking about it for 25 years, was to be a place not to sit around talking about drugs and alcohol, because it's not what's wrong. It's just what gets people in the door. What's wrong is the lifetime of pain that everybody who comes here has been carrying around. So I look at all that stuff as the burdens that we carry. And
Yes.
I just wanted to create a place, a safe place for people to unburden themselves.
Yes.
The
Okay.
most comforting words, you reminded me of this. The most comforting words, I think, are me too. And in that moment that you realize that your story is somebody else's story, when up to that point you thought maybe you were the only one, that's a life-changing experience.
That's such a great point.
And it's really beautiful here because it happens all the time. Oh my God, I'm not the only one. It's a very common experience.
And do you ever think about if you could get that message across to young children, such as yourself, when you were 5 or 6, when this happened to you, if you could get that message through, then you're not alone, that this is what you're feeling is a normal response to something very wrong. Would that make a difference?
I have to think that it would have somehow, however, my 5, 6, 7-year-old brain would have processed that information, choosing to think that it would have impacted things significantly because it wouldn't have needed to be a secret.
Right. Do you have any language that we can share with the parents for their kids, just when we're generally talking about personal safety and that sort of thing that would help with the child recognizing abuse or something inappropriate and being able to see it what it is or understand it a little better in that young mind?
Sure, I think maybe not we make light of it where we say kids learn about good touch and bad touch, and
Mhm,
there's usually a doll involved. But
mhm.
that conversation happens oftentimes when a child's being questioned because of suspicion. I think
Right.
it could happen much more educationally and lovingly, not because of a fear, which is going to be delivered in an anxious, fearful way, but just at bath time, going over a child's body parts, paying attention to the comfort or discomfort that a child has when discussing their body. Are there signs? I was just going to say there's so many, but I don't think they're not normally thought about. Being fearful in childhood or not wanting to undress or not wanting to be seen, secretive, hiding outside of play. I don't want your viewership to get all anxious like me, but
I
I
like
do think
that.
I do think that there are opportunities that come up naturally.
Mhm.
I remember, just as a side, in grad school, a professor said, "No client will ever go anywhere you're not willing to go." And I'm
Mm,
reminded of that
powerful.
when it comes to parenting, that
Excellent.
our children won't go anywhere that the parent themselves won't go. So our ability as parents, I guess, to take risks and enter into conversations that might be uncomfortable,
Right.
has tremendous value.
I love that. It makes
It-
me think of, I think overall, in general, it's a really good parenting strategy to look for the teachable moments instead of coming in with an agenda at one time. Wait for the teachable moment to arise and be ready with your messaging.
That's a perfect phrase, teachable moment.
That's what you made me think of when you said that. That's excellent advice.
And then for the child, the teachable moment is going to create an opportunity for meaning making for the child.
Right.
I think the nice part of what you said is that it is not going in with an agenda, but
Right.
where the developmental stage the child's at, they will make meaning out of what's being talked about. That's natural to their developmental level.
And what can you tell us, Andrew, about back to the statistics? How bad is addiction and is it growing and how fast is it increasing in society and particularly in children?
That's a big one. Every generation will say that drugs were the worst in the
Ah,
generation before them. Maybe not everyone will say, but it's not uncommon
generally,
to hear that.
yeah.
I think right now, for the past decade, we have, as a society, had opiates on the mind because of OxyContin and, well, that in large part because of OxyContin. And the clients that we get now, we used to treat people for the big three, which were heroin, alcohol, and benzodiazepines, Valium, Ativan. And the order has been shifted now. It is very difficult in society nowadays to find heroin. Very difficult, at least in Los Angeles and in major cities, because fentanyl has replaced it. It's
Ah,
cheaper and stronger. We're seeing more overdose deaths from opiate use or fentanyl use than
mhm.
any other time in history. And consequences are more severe now.
Sure.
One, like in Los Angeles, for example, where I am, these pills, they're called pressed blues, and God knows what's in them, but they're most of the time sold as kind of not pharmacy pills not gotten at the pharmacy, and they're blue and they're small, and most of the time they have fentanyl and sometimes methamphetamine and sometimes a little bit of this and a little bit of that. You give a pill to two different people, one person may die from that first exposure and one person may not, because they're made in different levels and concentrations of fentanyl.
Not necessarily the same dose.
It
There's no way
isn't,
to predict. Yeah,
there's
I
no way to
see.
predict. That's the way to say it. There's no way to predict.
Yes, there's no room for error, right? Because of the fentanyl, I guess, being laced in.
Yeah,
So what should we be telling our teenagers as parents?
so glad that you're having this conversation with your teenager.
Yeah, you can't experiment. Find another way to experiment, not drugs,
Yeah,
because you could die the first time, right?
yeah, the concept of all generations of children say it's normal to experiment, to your point. That might be, but there's never been a more dangerous time to experiment. And can't start talking about these things soon enough, I think. I think the picture for families is to have conversations about family values from a place of not kind of the reinforcement that is most common for us. Don't do this. A different way of saying that is, can we agree as a family that these are the things that are important to this family? And whether it's
That.
honesty, or because it's easier to get buy-in when you have a conversation about, do you remember our agreement? As
I love
opposed,
that language.
if you can stay away from why questions,
Yeah.
which to be experienced as shaming, even though that's
Yes.
not the intent.
And then I imagine later, if there is an infraction or they get off track, you can say, hey, remember our agreement? We agreed. This is what
Yeah.
we are doing.
And
So
then it allows us to get off of that we don't want to happen, but focus the conversation and energy on, I know that there are people can argue with the fact that a child learning to make and keep commitments and agreements
I love that.
is one of the most valuable skills a person can learn. And
Love
so it's just another opportunity, I think, to work in the agreement aspect. But
that
you
is
are so right about, I hadn't even thought about that. There's no room for experimenting with certain things anymore. There's a highlighter that a client came in with, or that looked like a highlighter, like one of those yellow, but it wasn't a highlighter. It was a vape pen made to look like a highlighter, filled with THC oil.
Mm,
So topic,
yes,
but
that the kids are reaching for all of these,
creative ways.
yes. And so obviously kids, especially, it to some extent want to experiment and test the limits of the world. How do you tell the difference between a normal, healthy kid who has past trauma and is pretty mentally well developed, but just wanting to experiment versus a child who is really feeling a void or whatever you consider the high risk for addiction, and that they are actually using or seeking these substances in order to cope with trauma or something that the cover pain? Or how do you tell the difference? How do we tell the difference as parents?
Man, your question
Or does it
matters. It's a
okay?
brilliant question, and I think incredibly difficult to know. We don't really know that something is going to meet a need of ours, conscious or unconscious, until we engage in whatever that behavior is. Specialize and focus on adolescent girls who self-injure. And be a thing. It was about maybe 15 years ago. It was kind of going around the country where it was called cutting clubs. And it was kids who were getting together within the peer group and experimenting with crazy, and for adults, stupid, pardon my word there,
Or
like scary behavior.
yeah.
And I remember thinking back then, the scary part of that is not it's done in the peer group, but it's for the kid who gets a little a different reaction than the other kids, and then leaves the peer group and maintains that behavior, but all by themselves.
Right, makes sense.
And so I think we can maybe apply that to your question. How do you know the difference? If it's behavior that's done within the peer group, there's lots of reasons: the experimentation, rite of passage, fear of embarrassment, not wanting to look foolish in front of your friends. There's normal childhood pressures. For kids who have other things going on, maybe they have more anxious attachment style. The child, for example, with an anxious attachment style is going to be at greater risk to seeking out behaviors and people that their anxiety.
Sure.
And
So,
so if you
yeah.
don't know, a child doesn't know what their attachment style is, but there are things that we can pay attention to as parents and family friends and things like that. Does the child lean more towards isolating? Do they complain or seem sad? I have twin daughters, and although they're adults now, want to do it again, be a kid nowadays.
Yeah. We're up against a lot as parents. We really are, and our kids are up against a lot. That's why it's so important for experts like you to help us out.
Well, even this, like, cell phones really changed parenting. It's
Yes. I was going to ask you about screen addiction for kids.
a big problem, obviously, because it promotes isolation. It has changed the concept of play. We have defined the word friends.
Wow.
My parents having a conversation with their kids now, when a child says, yeah, I was just online talking to my friends. If you ask a few follow-up questions, they're not going to describe what we as parents think of as the definition of a friendship.
Wow. Yes.
Because they never met this person potentially.
Yeah, that's a great point.
We tend to take more risks online than in person because there's that natural barrier, distance, and exposes people.
Yes, that makes sense.
So, and it's just difficult to set limits with our teenagers to begin with.
Yes. Okay, so it's so good. Just to recap a little bit, we've touched on anxiety being a root of
Yeah,
addiction. We've on the
trauma.
trauma, absolutely. And I want to get more into specifics and specific challenges that come up for parents and decisions that we have to make along the way that could help us avoid trauma. And you mentioned attachment too, which is it's all tied in together, of course, but let's back to the idea of attachment. You mentioned anxious attachment, and I know there's also avoidant attachment and the
Secure attachment.
organized. Yeah, think talk a little bit more about the different types and how that provides or increases risk for developing addiction in children.
Sure. Well, just the first thing I'm thinking of is on our website, I have this a very simple sentence, and it says, relationships are the antidote.
Yeah.
And generally, people will say, to what? And my answer is, to everything. We, more than ever in history, we are drowning in technology and screen time and gadgets. And although we are flooded with it, I think people are starving for connection.
Absolutely.
We know when it comes to marketing, we have about 3.5 seconds tops to get somebody hooked in. That's the brilliance of TikTok and the old, Snapchat. And there are these little hits of dopamine in the brain.
That's it.
And they just chase those little hits.
I'm so on the same page, and I'm so glad you're bringing this up because I had, and I think I'm seeing so much everywhere in our modern culture that people are substituting different things that could become addictions, but at least aren't necessarily healthy. They're substituting those things for attachment. And I'm so grateful that I have been able to study with some of the top child development in the world and report from their research and understand just in time for my daughter. Thank God. And so she has a very good attachment, but I still find I was lucky enough to get the guidance that I needed to avoid the things that derailed attachment. But still, I noticed her, I think around like 11 or 12, I started to notice her reaching for her phone when she's stressed, right? So instead of normally what we see as parents and attachment science is based on is that the child, when they feel stressed, they immediately seek the attachment figure, right, to regulate their emotions. But and now instead of reaching out for the parent, that going to the secure base to feel regulated, to get back, under anxiety and everything, instead of that, they just dive in, like just to the device as a distraction from their anxiety or whatever it is that we want them to come to us. But it's just so easy. How do parents compete with that advice?
Yeah, well, a parent and a clinician myself, I don't honestly know. What I do know, 3/4 of my career has been with adolescents, is that change happens in a family when parents get afraid. What is not generally a good situation is when we abruptly change the rules on our children.
Good.
Because we're afraid, because they've upped the ante and pushed the boundaries past our comfort level, and then we clamp down on them out of fear. So parenting out of fear helps us feel better. Doesn't usually produce the result that we're looking for in our children.
Okay.
We're really, a lot of it is about us. Your
Our
child
fear.
running, exactly.
Yeah.
So if our children stop doing what they're doing, I don't have to be as afraid.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really important parenting moment to consider or to ask oneself, do I do that? Do I change the rules on my child because I'm afraid of something that's going on? And it's okay. Some other great words for that are great for children is when the parent says, I'm sorry. Not only does it teach children that it's okay to make mistakes, but the value and the power of an apology. Not manipulatively in this case,
Hmm.
but heartfelt, like, honey, I made a mistake. I wasn't informed, and now I am. And the mistake I made was this, and I'm going to need your help, is a
Ah,
much different conversation
that's
than, no, you can't go out with your friends tonight.
yes.
We
Not
talk,
changing the rules too abruptly and utilizing apology, utilizing teachable moments that come up in context. And it sounds like what the relationship that you're describing is more collaborative.
yep, that's a great word. It is more collaborative. I was thinking all the shit that I brought as a parent and that each of us bring to raising our children. I don't know if it doesn't get enough attention, but it's really informative if we use ourselves to help us navigate through raising our own. Most of us think things like, well, when I'm a parent, I'm not going to do X, Y, or Z.
Sure.
But we don't tend to think about, when I'm a parent, what I am going to prioritize is. And I think that's a more beneficial, because everything that I like, I'm never going to do this, that's just all negative.
Right. Yeah. It's like we have to focus on the positive outcome and the positive strategies, right?
Yeah.
It's always a challenge because of the fear that we have as parents.
So like I had mentioned earlier about no child will go where a parent's not willing to go. I think in this situation, that's true as well. If a parent is not inclined to be vulnerable with their children, we do not tend to raise vulnerable children because it's not been modeled.
Right.
And
And
so balance. I just think that,
ability to connect emotionally is tied into that vulnerability.
yeah,
Yes. Okay. Because I'm thinking it's a emotional connection that is going to ameliorate the tendency toward addiction or filling. Is it filling a void? Is that what addiction is too?
yeah. I having the ability to stop the world metaphorically and get off for a little while is a
Mm,
very powerful superpower
yes.
to have. And
Escapism.
yes, and we tend to repeat behaviors that have produced a positive outcome. And so you mentioned, the child who is stressed out and goes right to their phone.
Mm,
Their brain has made a notation.
yeah.
Um, when our nervous system gets activated, this behavior soothes my nervous system. And so without thinking, that's
Yeah.
just what kids will do.
Yes.
Um,
Okay, and tell me what you think about this, Andrew, because when I noticed that, I thought, okay, my fear response, I'm so glad you said that because I know that's been one of my challenges. And I know that is, I see it in some of the parents that I've coached. And it's so, you're so right. That is a typical response that we have. And so my fear response was to just not, okay, I'm exaggerating, but snatch it out of her hand and
yeah,
her, make her talk about it. And I didn't do that because that, that would be to even more stress, right? Or that would be more stressful for her. So I just got beside her and kind of looked at what she was looking at and try to slowly engage her in conversation. And it pulled her out of that. Once I hit on something that she did want to talk about, then she started talking to me, and then it's more directed toward me, and we can have a conversation and just work through her feelings or get it off her chest, whatever's bothering her. And then she is no longer engaged with the phone. She's engaged with me. Then she's talking about her feelings and going on from there. So
you actually,
that is that the way to redirect that seeking, dopamine seeking, I guess?
Yeah, I heard a couple of great things. One, you're aware of the fear that you were in. You solved your own problem. And I do think it's important to see this in part as this was a problem that you were having.
Hmm.
Your daughter didn't recognize going to
Yeah,
her phone as a problem.
right.
But you used, I guess the point about relationships are the antidote.
Yes.
You prioritized the human connection
Yes.
between mother and child, and it had a good outcome.
Yes,
And
but
she
it
put her
has to
phone down.
be it's just back to everything you're saying about the attachment being the most
Everything.
important.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's everything. It's everything, right? And
And
so,
it's hard to, if I don't have an attachment with my 16-year-old, it's going to be a really difficult process to make one
yes. Have you
because,
happened
yeah,
to have read Dr. Gabor Mate's book, Hold On to Your Kids?
uh-huh, all of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're
There's,
sounding a lot like him right now, which
oh,
is a huge compliment.
oh, thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, I used to overcomplicate everything. And it's something that I've kind of consciously worked on is not making things more complicated than they need to be.
Excellent.
So an example of that would be when, as a parent, I don't know what to do, I will ask my child for help.
Wow.
And for some parents, for some people, they're just not naturally comfortable asking for help because
Yeah.
of their own story. So
Wow.
in the example you gave about with your daughter, I thought of I thought of that I might have said, when you're finished on the phone, I'd love to ask you a couple of questions
Oh, that's good.
to show a little bit of respect, I suppose,
Sure.
to not change the rules abruptly, to let her know that there was something that I needed. So, and then I would have said, in my case, Sydney or Haley,
Great names.
I'd like your help with something. Is it okay if I ask you questions? The type of therapist I am, um, I've just kind of naturally gone towards this permission asking and granting position,
Mm-hmm.
not because I necessarily need permission, but because it increases buy-in on the other side.
Sure. Getting their
So,
body. Yeah.
right. So I find it very powerful to begin with, would it be okay? And if my kid says, yeah, I've got them, I've got their attention.
I love that.
And so I would say, honey, here's what happens to me. I would have said, this is what I observe happening, and I'd like your help in knowing how can you and I find a way to talk about when you're stressed out and you go to your phone, I get worried that you aren't going to choose the relationships in your life to help you when you're stressed, but you're going to isolate with your phone.
Mm,
Something that
yeah.
draws attention to what's going on with the parent.
It's so consistent with a lot of what I learned from Dr. Daniel Siegel and as I mentioned, Dr. Gabor Mate.
Uh-huh.
But this attachment science and attachment, call it a parenting style, but
Mhm.
I think it's just the healthy way to raise children. And it's people think of it as co-sleeping and breastfeeding and using gentle words and not spanking. And it is all those things. But what you're describing is so comprehensive. It's a way of collaborating with your child, getting their buy-in. Everything you're describing it's respectful. And I think that we should respect our children just as we expect them to respect us. Not that they're in charge, but there's just this strange railroading approach that I think, at least in past generations, was really pushed on parents. I think from religion, sometimes, and maybe just out of desperation, but this authoritarian parenting style that is really it kind of hamstrings us, right? Because we can't meet the child where they are. It's just like, do this, do that. It's my way or the highway, and there's no collaboration. Can you speak to the authoritarian parenting style and what we should be avoiding, I guess, as parents?
Yeah, I think that we should like anything else, we should be avoiding extremes of anything. And I was in listening to you kind of outline this perspective on the change in parenting styles over time.
Mhm.
I just think there has to be a balance, that there are times when it is not democratic, where
Mhm.
I am the parent and this is the way it's going to be. And I hope to be able to explain where it is that I'm coming from. But
Right.
sometimes as parents, we don't or can't, or whatever the reason is.
Yes. And
Um,
I think people misunderstand. So the research shows, and I'm sure you can speak to this better than I, but it's the authoritative parenting that has the best outcomes. So you've got authoritarian where it's like, do what I say, and it's kind of like a drill sergeant, and you don't care about getting their buy-in, and you are dominant. But then there's authoritative, and you're still in charge, and that's why I love attachment, because if the attachment's in place and we've done that really well in the early years, then they're going to trust us when we have to say, look, this is not a negotiable thing. I'm your parent and I have to choose this because I have the knowledge and the experience that you don't have yet in order to help you make this the correct choice. So that's more of like the authoritative approach. And then we have permissive, which also has negative outcomes. So the middle one, the authoritative, it has the best outcomes, right? Do I have that right?
it's the way that I know it in my ADHD brain is the authoritative parent. It's where parents tend to set very clear rules and expectations, but also provide support and warmth.
Yeah.
In contrast to authoritarian, which is the not only having strict rules, but it's the enforcement of the strict rules. It's the lack of elasticity.
Mm.
And permissive, low demands are made, more lenient, allow a lot more freedom, kind of more democratic. A lot of, what do you think, honey? Or, what do you think about this? And then at the other end of the spectrum is just the neglectful parent.
Oh, yes.
So I don't think that any one of them in of themselves are right or wrong. I just think there's a time for
Ah,
each of the different styles
okay.
to,
So it's more about the
to
context.
show up. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because when it comes to use for, but mom, why can't I smoke pot? Everybody smokes pot and experiments. Well, that is going to that has to plug in somewhere into the parent. And if we get back to the family values conversation that ideally would have happened, that is where I would advise people to let difficult conversations about drug use and experimentation. I do not think that drug use is natural. I'm sorry. I do not think drug use is normal. I think that we have normalized it
Mm.
because it's so prevalent
Well,
and
we've
because
also normalized detachment. I think that detachment is actually pushed in our society today. I see it everywhere.
what would be an example of where you see that? It's interesting.
Hmm.
Wh-
I think that a lot of it comes from the feminist movement, pushing, brainwashing young women. I remember as a college girl, just the propaganda and brainwashing coming at me, where you're supposed to be just like a man, and taking away the biological realities of women as mothers, and telling women that they should be able to
Do it
make
all.
much money as a man and raise children at the same time. That the baby, of course, a lot of my work is focused on early childhood, babyhood, and toddlerhood. And so there are, I think, some pretty detrimental pitfalls for especially feminist parents in that stage of development, because they're told to return to work straight away as fast as they can. It creates a barrier to breastfeeding, which we know how important that is for health and well-being. They don't get enough touch, they don't get enough holding and affection, and separation with the mother, I think, is unnatural. So rushing women back to work, full-time early daycare, losing out on breastfeeding, corporal punishment, again, like the negative touch, spanking,
Yeah.
that can be a trauma, not like the trauma you experienced, but some traumas are not recognized as traumas, but they are.
Mhm.
Circumcision. I don't know how you feel about that, but my co-author to one of the books that I've worked on, she actually came across the MRI studies of a baby boy having a circumcision, and it definitely altered the brain that would become the social emotional part of the brain. So it's causing brain damage. I mean, these kind of traumas are literally causing brain damage. And so, I mean, I see it in those early childhood issues, but I do see it just in the culture at large. I see it in the relationship space, romantic. I see it in the relationship space too. What about you? Like, what do you see? Do you see anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, those are really solid examples that you just gave that don't, I mean, I wouldn't have thought of some of those, but as you were talking, I was like, yeah, 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 there's that. So I just think it's a tremendous opportunity for us as a culture and for people who want to be more informed to have outlets like yourself and your podcast, um, to talk about and learn about things that are really important. I think that I I agree, that certainly about the trauma and what is for one person might not be for another. What this conversation, which I'm grateful for, is highlighting for me, is how complicated the reality is when it comes to relationships. There are forces involved that we're aware of and we're not aware of
Mm-hmm.
that impact and shape, our ability to form relationships with people. And in this
Yes,
case, our children. And a wounded parent will raise a child differently
yes,
than a parent that is not wounded,
yes. So we really need to, as parents, heal our own childhood traumas and our own traumas so we can be the best for
or
our.
at least model to our kids the incredible value in saying things like, I don't know. Like, it's okay not to know, but I know where I can go look or who I can ask to
That's
find
it.
the answer.
Yeah.
It would be far more, I think, helpful is to help our children learn to tolerate times of distress and how to navigate through them, not to
Right.
avoid them altogether, because shit happens in
Yeah.
life and we
I
can't
love that.
bubble wrap them.
Yes, I love that because people think that attachment parenting is permissive parenting where you're just their friend. And it's not. It just means that you have built this trust and this bond that gives them a stability and a sense of safety that will help them navigate anything that comes up, whatever that comes up. And parents are feeling so overwhelmed with conflicting information and they're seeing how complicated it is. And it's almost like the more you learn, the more complicated you see it is. And so I just want to offer parents that are feeling overwhelmed by how complicated it is that if you have the attachment, healthy attachment in place, then it almost doesn't matter how complicated it is, right? Because if you have that, you'll be able to navigate all the complexities. Do you
Yeah,
agree?
if I do, I have another note that I wrote was for a parent, and I use this to this day. Before I say something, I will ask myself, can the relationship I have with this person today tolerate the conversation I want to have?
Ooh, that's excellent. That reminds me of the zone of proximal development. You don't go from here to here all of a sudden. Like you said, don't change the rules drastically all of a sudden. It's the same, right? Concept. You meet them where they are and you take baby steps to where you want to go, the goal.
Yes, and I'm very aware of where I'm at. If
Mm,
I am
yeah.
angry, frustrated, or not informed, well,
Mm-hmm.
that's not the greatest time for me to have a serious conversation.
So important.
And then the other note I wrote was, remembering, I guess this just for me, I try hard to remember before I speak, who is this for?
Mm,
What I want to say right now, who's it for? Is it for me? Is this to make me feel better? Or is it for my child?
that's good.
Or is it for the relationship? because those are three very different conversations. If it's for me, if it's for them, or if it's for the relationship,
Right.
three very, very different talking points.
Excellent point. That's very good. And I wanted to ask you because I know you have written a book called The Longing of Lonely Children.
I'm in the process of writing.
Oh, you're writing it now.
Yes, I am writing. It's called Foraging: The Longing of Lonely Children. And I guess the juxtaposition between how we normally think of foraging for food and shelter and safety, and applying that mindset to what it's like for lonely children and how they forage. And so I'm in the process of putting that together, because I think
I love that.
we have, I mean, not just children, the idea that we're drowning in technology and starving for connection
Yes.
highlights the really strange time that we live in, where I know a lot of lonely people, and I'm not even, not as a therapist sitting with clients, friends. I think that it's important what purpose to understand what purpose loneliness, how it affects people. Is it by choice? Is it by circumstance? Is it out of protection?
I think there's an epidemic of loneliness and detachment. And you hear a lot of rhetoric around, oh, you don't really need a man. You don't really need a woman. You don't need a family. You can have, all these messages that people say it's not a problem if it's not a problem. But then they have some addiction over here that they're using to cope with the missing connection, the loneliness. And they don't even connect the dots, right?
Yeah, for sure. My day is exponentially better already just because you afforded me the opportunity to have a conversation, and that doesn't involve my phone, and it's just the sharing of ideas without, there's things that get in the way. Well, what if the person doesn't agree with me? Or what if, well, that's all anxiety and
Yes.
fear.
I think it
So
may have been Gabor Mate that said the root of addiction is anxiety for various reasons. And I think in early attachment, the things that I listed earlier of circumcision, cry it out sleep training, and early extended daycare, these are relational traumas. And that's especially, so can you talk about why that is? Relational traumas are so serious while the brain in early brain development, let's say.
as we kind of got one chance at this, that I can't tell you how many times in therapy, and I myself have wished to be able to go back and undo things that were done or do things differently, but none of us get that chance. And the idea of freedom is having the ability to not look at our past and wish that it was different.
Oh,
That
wow.
would be freedom.
Yes. Regret.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so freedom of regret to me sounds like acceptance. And as a recovering alcoholic, on page 414 of the big book, which I have, I don't know, laminated in big format, small format, pocket size, the passage says, and acceptance is the answer to all my problems today.
Wow.
If I
just lowered my anxiety just now. That's awesome. Now, what are you referring to as the big book?
Alcoholics Anonymous.
Okay.
Yeah, it's known as the big book, and it's there's lots of different versions, but it's a big blue book. And I don't know, I think it has wisdom in it, whether you're an alcoholic or not. It just happens to be written by and for alcoholics.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Good to know. I noticed on I read your website for Encino Detox Center, and I know you have some proprietary models of treatment that are super interesting. I want to touch on if you're okay with that. One thing that was really interesting was how people heal from trauma in order to heal their addictions. You have the 6 Fs. Can you talk a little bit about that approach?
Yeah, the basis of it is in a treatment model called ARC, which stands for attachment, regulation, and competency. And it's a trauma-informed treatment. It's the difference in how we speak to our clients and with our clients, the relationship that is formed from before they even get here, that we have some reparative work. We get our clients usually not more than 30 days. And so the ability to spend 6 months in the therapy world is the joining and accommodating and relationship development. We don't have a lot of time. And so the model lends itself to short-term relationships, but with the foundation of trust and respect.
Excellent.
And so
Yes.
regardless of what the person's problem is, so to speak, everybody who loves somebody who struggles with an addiction would like, they don't use these words, but they're looking for 3 things for their loved one to have: safer attachments in their life, not attachment and an affinity to a substance, but ideally to a person, have the ability to self-regulate without needing something on the outside, taking something on the outside and putting on the inside like a drug. It becomes paramount in a person's life. If a person is attached to their drug of choice and they're having a relationship with their substance, before we can help somebody surrender that attachment, what are we offering in its place?
And that's a relationship to people.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's where the relationship is the antidote.
Yes.
That's where that comes
The
from.
antidote. I want to title this podcast that. That's so good. I'll give you credit, of course, but I love that. It really encapsulates everything that we're talking about, how important the relationship is. And it sounds like in the therapeutic approach, you're reverse engineering maybe what was missing in childhood or as the attachment system formed. And you're able to go back and heal that with the anecdote.
Well, we either are or we're not, but we certainly try. I have not met somebody who has left here and didn't think that it was the best decision that they ever made for themselves.
That's awesome.
And that doesn't mean that they're sober for the rest of their lives, because we
Yeah.
don't know yet. But it's the idea that you and I both have survived a million things that have never happened. You know what I mean?
So true. I know exactly what you mean.
And so,
Catastrophizing and imagining the worst
yes,
outcome. Oh,
are
yeah,
words like I can't
Yeah.
do it. Well,
absolutely.
it is hard to accomplish something if your thought for the day is I can't.
What an amazing reminder. And I love that all of your therapy, your treatment, which you've obviously been doing it long enough to know what works the best and what you've landed on, is relational. I studied Bruce Perry a lot and read all his books. And if you read about how trauma is healed, how the best ways it is healed, which that's what's going to heal the addictions, right? Or at least one of the main ways is to heal the trauma. So when I realized that it's relational, like the antidote, like you say, the therapy is relational. That's how you heal it. It just really validates the importance of early relational care, attachment care, parents that are really present and well attached during that period.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all of your time.
It was a real pleasure, and I very much appreciate your asking me to be a guest.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for joining us today on the Primal Parenting Podcast. Don't forget to comment below about one of the 5 baselines that you picked up on during this interview. For me, I especially appreciated Andrew saying that play is something that is compromised with the childhood traumas. I call them mini traumas, but sometimes they're major traumas. But these common mistakes that parents make in babyhood, especially, but in very early parenting, that do cause trauma. And we don't think of it as trauma, but to a baby whose very specific survival instincts are require a specific types of care, and things like cry it out or sudden, without a good transition daycare where you haven't been gradually transitioned into it and the baby isn't, um, basically controlling distress is so incredibly important as the nervous system sets up. And I had never really thought of specifically that any of these little traumas that happen, um, anything that compromises the attachment relationship, developing properly, um, the anxiety that Andrew talks about throughout, all of those things are interfering with the play state. And the play state is formative in early development. And it's healing throughout life, being able to access that play state that's built in the very first year of life. And then especially in the first 5 years of life. So Andrew bringing up play after the amazing interview I had with Michael Mendeza, please check that out. I'll link that one as well. I think it's the 4th episode of the Primal Parenting podcast with Michael Mendeza. It's all about play. It's about the neurological effects of the play state and how it's the key to discipline. And it's creating so much brain development, just being able to play, and then how to use play as a tool in those teachable moments. And so I liked that. That would have been my comment, but you make your comment, what stood out to you, what resonated, and we will put the winner. We'll just draw a winner from randomly from the comments, and we'll put that in the comments here below. And then you can, we'll reach out and get in touch, and we'll get you into the private group and the online course, which includes coaching directly from me on this no cry system based on brain science. So parents can get the sleep that they need by learning how to make the baby feel safe instead of teaching the baby not to make any noise. Okay. So it's very, very different than traditional sleep training. And that is the gift that we have for you today. Please like, subscribe, and again, don't forget to comment. You don't want to miss your chance to win on this one. And we'll see you next time on the Primal Parenting Podcast. Thank you.